Hey everyone, welcome to DNA Results Part 2. Yes, this video is a long time in coming. I promised it over a year ago. But hey, it's just as well that I waited because, as most people know, AncestryDNA has tweaked their algorithms and upgraded everyone's results. So I have a whole new data set to talk about from them. What a lot of people don't know is that 23andMe has done the same thing. So I also have new results from 23andMe. And as promised, I did have my DNA analyzed by Family Tree DNA. So there are three new sets of information that we're going to be talking about. And we'll get to that point, I promise. But this is probably going to be a longer video than I originally planned. Because I realized I have a whole bunch of loose ends to tie up from DNA Results Part 1. We're going to start out with that. And let me say at the outset that if you stumbled onto this video and you did not see DNA Results Part 1, stop this video, go back, and in the description box I have the link to the first DNA video, and watch that, because this will only be meaningful for you if you've seen the original video. Now, for those of you who are laser focused on the DNA results and don't give a hoot about any preliminaries, I will put the exact jump-in point for the DNA results down below, and you can go right there. Okay. So, DNA Results Part 1, as of this moment, has generated around 250,000 views, which for me is a lot of views. For some people, that's just another day at the YouTube office. For me, that's a lot. And I think it goes to suggest what an appetite there is out there, not so much for DNA results, but for a discussion of culture, race, racial identity, ethnicity, all the things that I talked about in that video, in particular the discussion of slavery. That produced a whole lot of commentary from people who saw the video. In fact, I've gotten over 2,000 comments from the first video, and I confess that I no longer respond to individual comments very often. It's just too time-consuming. But I read every comment, I take note of every comment, I appreciate every comment, and I encourage comments. So rest assured that if you've written me something, I've read it and thought about it. So in that spirit, I thought I would start out this video with an FAQ section, frequently asked questions. I thought I would bundle a lot of the questions into various themes that seem to be important to people, and give some answers. So here we go. First question went something like this. Jeff, who are you? Are you some sort of historian or something? What's your story? No, I'm not a historian. I'm retired now, but in my earlier life, I was a psychologist, a therapist, and yes, I did teach at the college level early on in my career. But I never taught anything historical. I taught, standard psychology classes. My interest in the slavery issue just sort of developed out of my general concern about social and political topics. And in my general reading, I came upon a body of information about slavery that I thought was really interesting. And it was clear to me that the things that I talked about in the first video were well known to professional historians, but yet were not out there in the public domain. So I thought I would share them. And, they seem to have been well appreciated by people. Which leads to frequently asked question number 2. A number of people very perceptively challenged me on something I said. And the question went something like this. Jeff, you said that more enslaved individuals actually passed through Jamaica than came to the United States. How can that be? When you look at the current census of Jamaica, they have all of 3 million people there. When you look at the population of the United States, There are upwards of 45 million African Americans. How could Jamaica have started out with a larger population of African individuals? Well, the answer to that question is really interesting. The conditions during the slave era in Jamaica were so barbaric, so inhumane, so horrific, that the mortality rate for slaves was simply off the charts. They had trouble, and when I say they, I mean the British slave owners, the Spanish slave owners, whichever country happened to have colonized Jamaica at the time. They had trouble maintaining a zero population level. They had negative population because they were losing so many people. So you might have thought that they would have stopped and said, well, geez, we need to really upgrade the conditions that our workforce lives in because we're hurting our own bottom line by not being able to maintain a workforce. But I guess that thinking was a little too enlightened for them, and their solution to the problem was to simply churn more slaves in. For everyone that died, they would churn in more slaves. So at the end of the slave era in the mid-1800s, yes, they might have had a census of 300,000 slaves, but it may have taken twice that or three times that many to achieve that number. Now, in the United States, there was a barbarism of a completely different nature that prevailed. Slaves were constantly reminded, in a threatening way, that your body is not your own, and we expect you to reproduce. We expect you to have children, because we don't think of children as children, we think of them as economic units. So if, for example, a couple was not reproducing, they might have privileges taken away in terms of work assignments or food or comfort or whatever, or the owner might actually threaten to send one of them away, sell them somewhere else. So there was a constant threat that hovered over slaves about reproduction. And the historical consensus on this is that the average enslaved female in the United States had 9 children. Now, you have to remember also, one of the little-known facts about slavery is that after 1808, it was illegal to import or export slaves. That is, the institution was legal, but you couldn't transport slaves in or out of the country anymore. So the only way that you could improve your workforce was either by buying somebody else's slave or by the birth rate at your own plantation. So two very different types of inhumanity going on, but you could see how in that situation the United States could outdistance Jamaica's population exponentially. Next question. A number of people wrote in and had taken from my discussion of slavery the thought that, wow, I guess slavery wasn't as bad as we thought it was. Now, I don't really understand that logic, but I want to put it to rest right now. There's nothing about my discussion that indicated that slavery was any less morally objectionable than we knew it to be before. Slavery is a moral obscenity, whether it takes place in Charleston, South Carolina, whether it takes place in Sao Paulo, Brazil, or whether it takes place in the Congo in Africa. It is equally abhorrent in all those circumstances. So whether the bulk of slaves were going to Brazil or going to Barbados or going to the United States, the moral aspect of slavery is unchanged. If anything, the message in my discussion was that the reach of slavery, the breadth of slavery, the scope of it is greater than a lot of people thought. That it wasn't just a North American problem. It wasn't a United States problem. It was a Pan-American problem that left scars all over the Southern Hemisphere. Indeed, all over the Western Hemisphere are the scars of the transatlantic slave trade. Enough said on that. Now, many people wrote in just to express their appreciation for the family photos that I showed in the first video. And thank you very much for that. I didn't quite realize, I thought that they would add to the narrative, but I didn't realize quite the impact that they would have on people. And any number of people very smartly pointed out to me, Jeff, you're kind of lucky because it takes a certain amount of financial means, takes a certain amount of wherewithal back in 1910, 1908, to gather the whole family together, put the kids in their Sunday clothes, hire a photographer, and do all that needs to be done to generate photos that are going to survive over 100 years. And you're lucky that your mom's side of the family seemed to have the means to be able to do that. And that's absolutely true. But what I thought I would do today is offer a little slideshow from somebody who literally had no money whatsoever, had no means, and namely my dad. My dad's side of the family had no money, and I'd like to tell his story. So my dad grew up in the small, impoverished, rural town of McMinnville, Tennessee. And you can see him here in a picture at age 5. He's there with his sister, Jewel. He looks sort of like a mini man there, a little 5-year-old man. Now, his family grew up with no electricity, no fridge, no running water, no indoor plumbing, but plenty of rats and other vermin running around. And they survived largely through a vegetable garden that they had and all the rabbits that you could eat caught out in the woods behind their house. Now, when he reached high school age, he had to confront a problem that many black children had to confront in that era, which was a shortage of schools, a shortage of educational opportunities for them. One of the most shameful legacies of slavery was the indifference of the Southern white governments to providing education for black people. Now, as most people know, in almost all of the Confederate states, it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. Now, of course, those laws went away with abolition, but the attitude didn't go away. The Southern governments knew full well that the best way to keep a group downtrodden and subordinate was to make it hard for them to vote and hard for them to get an education. So during my dad's era, around 1 in 5 Southern black kids went to high school. Not college, mind you, high school. But my dad got lucky. A great Jewish businessman and philanthropist named Julius Rosenwald recognized the problem that I'm talking about and decided to do something about it. Rosenwald was one of the early owners of Sears and Roebuck, so obviously he was a very wealthy man, and he decided to put his wealth to good use. He set up a philanthropic foundation that did all sorts of good works all over the country, but the best remembered thing that he did was he was responsible for building hundreds of schools for black kids in the rural South. And my dad went to a Julius Rosenwald school called Bernard High School in McMinnville, Tennessee. Now, don't get me wrong, this was not some lavish school with lots of facilities and a great library. It was a building. It had a few books, and it had a few teachers. Now, my dad's main teacher was a diminutive black woman named Bessie Gwynn. Miss Bessie, as the students referred to her, was exceedingly smart, knowledgeable, and carried herself with great dignity. The students quickly learned, don't mess with Miss Bessie. So one day after school, she pulled my dad aside, and she said to him, listen, young man, you've got a good mind. You should be participating more in my English class, and you should be applying yourself more to your studies. Well, my dad looked at her somewhat sheepishly and said, well, Miss Bessie, I really ain't got much use for that Beowulf book and that Chaucer fella. Well, she got very angry, and she grabbed him by the shirt, and she said, listen, young man,
if you don't learn to read well and write well, you're never going to find your potential in life, so you may as well stop dreaming right now. And furthermore, I never want to hear you use the word ain't in my classroom again. Wow. Something that she said actually got through to him. Maybe it was the anger. Maybe it was that he sensed there was a compliment in there somewhere. But he became a reader, an avid reader. And even though neither he nor Miss Bessie were allowed into the whites-only McMinnville Library, by dint of great effort, she had established her own version of the Underground Railroad. She had found some white folks of great conscience out in the community who would go into the library, take out books, pass them along to her, and then she would give them to kids who wanted to read more, including my dad. Well, my dad eventually graduated as the valedictorian of his class of Bernard High School. And here you can see him sitting with a cousin on graduation day. And after that, he moved and spent some time with relatives in Nashville, got a menial job at a hospital in Nashville, and managed to scrape together enough money for him to enroll in historically black Tennessee State University for 2 semesters. He knew that this wasn't going to be sustainable, that he did not have enough money to go to Tennessee State for 4 years. So as he was reaching the end of the semester, he was, weighing his options and knew that he was going to have to drop out. Well, he got lucky again. The U.S. had just entered World War II, and at the urging of his wife Eleanor and of civil rights groups, President Franklin Roosevelt had realized that the time had come for the U.S. to start allowing a small number of black candidates into Naval Officer Training School. There had never been a black naval officer in U.S. history. So they began sending out notices to historically black institutions saying, if you have anybody who you think might qualify, might be a good candidate, nominate them, and we will give them consideration and see what happens. Well, just as my dad was about to drop out, the head of Tennessee State called him into his office and said, listen, young man, we've just nominated you for Naval Officer Training School. Well, my dad had no idea what he was getting into, whether this was a good idea, a bad idea, but he had no better option. And this turned out to be the greatest career-building decision that he ever could have made. First of all, it allowed him to interact with people of different races, different ethnicities, different geographical regions, people who he never would have come into contact with otherwise. This was a major cultural enrichment for him. Second of all, he was now participating in a great national struggle to defeat fascism. And that's something that gave his life a perspective, a focus, a definition. One grows up quickly in that environment. Third of all, he was deployed as a communications officer on a Navy refueling ship. Now, even though he had already decided that journalism was going to be his career, it only further impressed upon him the importance of the written word, the communications that he was responsible for, the press releases that he put out, the information that he passed along mattered. It had an impact. It made a difference to people. Fourth of all, he taught himself to type on the ship, which put him in good stead for the rest of his life. And finally, once the war was over and he left the Navy, he now had access to the GI Bill. So going to college wasn't going to be the same struggle anymore that it once was. Now, during his officer training period, in one phase, he was scheduled to go to the prestigious, well-regarded Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, to take some classes. Northwestern sent back word to the Navy, no, we will not allow a black person to live in a dormitory on our campus. Now think about that for a moment. Even as a representative of the U.S. Navy, Northwestern would not allow him to live in a dorm. So the Navy changed its plan and sent him to another well-regarded, prestigious college, but an infinitely more progressive one, Oberlin College in Ohio. Oberlin had been the first white school in American history to allow blacks to enroll, and that was in 1835. It was also the first college to go co-ed, and that was in 1837. So he had already spent time at Oberlin during his training period, and once the war was over and he left the Navy, he decided, well, I'm going to go back to Oberlin and complete my studies. Now, when he had been there before, he had really only interacted with other officer trainees. Now he was just a regular old part of a student body, and he quickly discovered something remarkable. Late at night, people would sit around debating the great political issues of the day. What should we do about the Middle East situation? What are the merits of the UN? What should the position of the U.S. be towards Soviet communism? Now, my dad had never in his life been in a situation where people simply sat around and batted around such lofty ideas and with such gusto. So he took a look around him and he said to himself, damn, I'm going to have to step up my game here. So eventually he graduated from Oberlin, not with a degree in journalism, but a degree in math, because he had had to take so many math and science courses as part of his officer training. It was easier for him to simply take those credits and get a degree in math. So fast forwarding now, he went up to the University of Minnesota, got a master's in journalism, got a job at the Minneapolis Tribune, the morning newspaper of the Twin Cities, and by 1960, when he was 35 years old, he was now an award-winning, prestigious journalist in Minneapolis. His reputation was such that the newspaper chose him to go to Washington, D.C., and do an interview and large feature piece on the charismatic senator from Massachusetts, John Kennedy, who was running for president. So he had his interview with the president, wrote a story about it, and Kennedy, as any candidate would be, was interested to know how the piece came out. Did this guy do a hatchet job on me? Did he advance my candidacy in the Midwest? So when Kennedy read the article, he said, well, he was tough, but he was very fair. And once Kennedy beat Nixon and became president, he had his staff contact my dad in Minnesota and ask him if he wanted to join Kennedy's State Department. And that was how we all moved to Washington, D.C., and my dad became one of Kennedy's circle of advisors. Now, in 1963, Kennedy appointed my dad the ambassador to Finland. And as you'll recall from the first video, there's a scene of my dad and me in a sauna in Helsinki. Well, that's why we were there. And we were scheduled to be there for 2 years. But 6 months into my dad's posting in Finland, Kennedy was assassinated. So Lyndon Johnson, now president, with whom my dad was also very close, called him back. The great journalist Edward R. Murrow, who was the head of the United States Information Agency, the USIA, had just died, and Johnson appointed my dad the head of the USIA. So here we are at the swearing in of my dad at the USIA. That is Johnson over at the lectern. That's Hubert Humphrey, soon to be vice president, standing over on the right side of the photo. And that kid in the light-colored, nonconformist sport coat, that's me. So my dad spent a few more years in government and then left the government to do what he really wanted to do: become a political writer, a syndicated columnist, a political pundit, a talking head, a TV personality, and went on to have a successful career. When he turned 50, he got a note, a letter from Tennessee, and it said, "I've been reading your syndicated column in the Nashville Tennessean. I'm so proud of you." Signed, Bessie Gwynn. It was his teacher from 30, 40 years earlier. And my dad was so touched by it. One of the many hats that he wore was as a contributor to Reader's Digest. And he wrote a story for Reader's Digest called The Unforgettable Miss Bessie, in which he told the story of how she had changed his life. But what he also did was, during a trip down south, he looked her up, tracked her down, and went to personally pay his respects to her. And here's the picture of my dad and Miss Bessie together. She's 80 years old there, and check out how fly she's looking with those Sunday formal gloves on. I'm told they had a great visit together that day. So I'm done now. I tell this story because I think it's instructive. This is America, after all. There are lots of rags to riches stories. But my dad would be the first one to tell you, yes, he made it out of the desperate poverty of McMinnville, Tennessee. But he only did it with a lot of help, both from the government and from private individuals. And he would tell you that for everyone like my dad who made it, there are 3 more back in McMinnville of great talent, languishing in poverty, in jail, or worse. Just some food for thought there. All right, let's get to the DNA. Okay, so here we are. Let's do a little refresher on my original results. My prediction was that it would be 50% Afro, 40% Euro, and I left 10% blank. And the results turned out to be, if you look at the sort of the average of 23 and Ancestry, around 52% European and around 47% African. Now, if you look at those numbers, you say, well, my goodness, the two companies are almost in perfect agreement. Why do you even need a second video to talk about it? Well, if you drill down a little bit more, what you find are some significant differences in terms of where they attribute that DNA. First of all, you have this percentage that leaps out at you. 16% Scandinavian, a number that I never bought from the beginning. You also have Iberian, meaning Portugal and Spain, 13%. Now, if you look over here, Scandinavian is 0.5%. Big disagreement between the two. Iberian is 2%. So there are great disagreements between the two. They agree that I have Jewish ancestry from Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. And there's a, sort of an agreement about my ancestry coming from the British Isles. But there's much more of a focus on Britain and Western Europe in 23andMe than there is in AncestryDNA. And with respect to Africa, the two companies also parted company a little bit, even though they both accorded about the same amount of my DNA to Africa. Their focus was somewhat different. Much greater focus on the part of 23andMe on Western Africa, where almost all of my African DNA was centered. Now, for AncestryDNA, yes, there was 32% credited to Western Africa, but a far greater proportion of my African DNA was given over to Southeastern Africa. So we're going to take a look and see if that difference between the two shrunk at all with the updates that they've provided. Or perhaps it grew even greater. Let's see. So here we have the new map for AncestryDNA. Now, remember that 16% number of Scandinavian descent that I never believed? Poof, it's gone in a puff of smoke. I now have 2% Swedish ancestry. So it went from 16 to 2. Now, I voiced my disbelief in the number originally. And if one of you wrote me, a million of you wrote me and said, don't you know that the Vikings raped and pillaged and plundered their way through the British Isles? That's why your Scandinavian ancestry is 16%. Yes, I get it, but that accounts for about 2% of my ancestry, not 16. That Iberian, Portugal, and Spain ancestry is now down to 1%. So I've lost 14% of my Scandinavian ancestry, and I've lost 12% of my Spanish and Portuguese ancestry. Gone. Well, thank goodness that AncestryDNA is willing to acknowledge that they've refined their protocols. Now, one of the other findings is that I do have a little Native American, but interestingly, it's not North American Native American ancestry, which would be here. It's South American, coming from the Andean countries like Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Peru. So that's interesting to see. So there's a significant change, and what AncestryDNA allows you to do is toggle back and forth. This was my original African profile, and you see all the Eastern and Southern representation there. Now when we update it, everything has sort of moved, and it's much closer to the original 23andMe profile. So interesting change from AncestryDNA. So the changes to my DNA profile under AncestryDNA brought it much closer to the original profile from 23andMe. They're looking much more similar now. But the question is, what changes have I seen in my 23andMe profile? So I have it here, and still the same European percentage. So we've got about 20% British and Irish. You'll recall that AncestryDNA now had my Ashkenazi Jewish percentage at 9. It's also 9 in 23andMe. And then, I've got sort of trace amounts of French and German. This is the Iberian part. And they still have this category of broadly Northwestern European, which is, all of this area, which includes the British Isles, and it includes France and Germany, and some parts of Scandinavia, but they can't assign it. But when we go down to Africa, that's when it starts getting really interesting. All of a sudden, they have found 18% of my DNA to be Nigerian. Now that is a huge change, and AncestryDNA has my Nigerian percentage at 2% as compared to now 18% for 23andMe. Another interesting change is they have 10% of my ancestry being Liberian, Ghanaian, and Sierra Leonean. Now, one of the interesting things about this finding is Liberia is a country that was only founded in 1821 by American slaves, freed slaves, who were returning to Africa. And they're saying that, this DNA from these three countries is unique and is quite different from the surrounding areas. Well, I assume when they say that my DNA is 10% Liberian, they're not talking about the freed slaves who returned to found that country. They're talking about the indigenous people that were living there before the American slaves ever got there, and who were very angry when the American slaves came and essentially colonized that territory and made it a new country. So, but it's unclear. They don't specify. Otherwise, they're not any great surprises. So the big new findings from 23andMe are that I have 18% Nigerian ancestry and 10% Ghanaian, Liberian, and/or Sierra Leonean ancestry. Whether those findings will survive the test of time, I have no idea. But it's interesting, and it's quite different from AncestryDNA. And when you're in the 23andMe mode, it's always interesting to take a look at your ancestry timeline. They look at your DNA and they can make these sort of educated guesses about when particular groups entered your ancestry timeline. And looking at mine, the most recent entry was the British and Irish. Grandparent, great-grandparent. And my newfound Nigerian ancestry is also very recent, as is the Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, both of which came in between 1800 and 1860. But just it's interesting to look back, Spanish, Portuguese, all the way back to the Native American ancestry, and it creates kind of a fascinating timeline. And one can only imagine how these groups converged upon one another over those periods of time. So when you use Ancestry and 23, you get lots of bells and whistles. It's a little bit like going to a nouveau exotic restaurant where there's always something new on the menu. But if you go to Family Tree DNA, it's very basic. It's meat and potatoes. It's like going to an Olive Garden. But sometimes Olive Garden really hits the spot. And I really like what I found with Family Tree DNA. I mean, it's very basic. Okay, African 46%. Well, that's the same as 23andMe and AncestryDNA. Now you'll notice this number 40. It's a little bit misleading because what they do is they separate the Jewish diaspora, which of course is also European, from their European category. But if you put the two together, you get 50%, and then you've got trace amounts, and you wind up with the same numbers that you had with Ancestry and 23. So let's look at my map here. So African 46, European 40. So let's look at European. Of my European 40%, they have all of it in the British Isles. No messing around with, exotic categories, Northwestern, Southwestern Europe. They basically find that overwhelmingly, my ancestry is from the UK. It's probably what I would have predicted before I ever took the test. Let's go to Africa. So of my 46% African DNA, 42% of it is in Western Africa. And here we have all of that. Now you'll notice Liberia, Sierra Leone, places that were highlighted, 10% of my DNA came from those areas in 23andMe. They're nowhere to be found with Family Tree DNA. So if we look at the final results, we really find a remarkable convergence from all three DNA companies. 23andMe, European 53, African 46. Family Tree DNA, when you total up everything, 40, 50, 51, 53, European 53, African 46. And AncestryDNA is pretty similar at 51 and 48. An enormous agreement among the three companies. Now, with respect to all the details within a continent, how the DNA is allocated, sure, there are going to be differences. And it may take years, decades to iron out who's more accurate with respect to those differences. But I'm pretty impressed by the level of agreement of all three companies.
So in summary, I'm something of a fan of DNA technology. I put it in the same category as the airplane and the communications satellite, in the sense that they all have the effect of shrinking the globe around us. However individual we may feel, DNA is a reminder that we're connected to places and people in distant parts of the globe, in many ways far beyond our imagination. We're part of a great human collective, a great common global village. and that's a good thing to remember. In addition, I believe that DNA has significance for the African American community also. The research has shown that the average African American in the United States has 25% European ancestry. What that means is that in 2019, nobody should be surprised when their DNA shows that they have European roots. That's also a reminder of the great diversity and richness in the African American experience in the United States. I believe we should embrace that reality, not run from it. Which is one reason why I get irked when I see people, for example, challenging presidential candidate Kamala Harris as to whether she's black enough to represent the black community. After all, her mother is from Chennai, India. Her father is from Jamaica. She spent time in Montreal. Doesn't that mean that she's not black enough? Of course it doesn't mean that. Let's take a step back in history and look at some of the great iconic figures in American history. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, orator, and writer, was probably 50% European in ancestry. The great firebrand Malcolm X had Scottish roots, red hair and freckles. Langston Hughes, one of the great chroniclers of the black experience and the father of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, was biracial, as was the great activist Julian Bond. And let's not forget about that crusader for social justice, Thurgood Marshall. Same ancestry. So I'm not going to bore everybody with a long list of names, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, but there is one last name I want to throw out there. Bob Marley. Bob Marley's dad was a white officer in the British Navy. When he was a kid, he earned the derisive nickname White Boy and was bullied because of his European looks. Well, that didn't stop Bob Marley from being one of the great troubadours of the Afro-Caribbean experience. Likewise, I believe that Kamala Harris's interesting background, Indian mother, Jamaican father, lived in Canada, actually gives her a fresh and interesting perspective as a black woman in the United States. So let's start judging the Kamala Harrises of the world in terms of their vision, their character, their moral authority, their leadership, and not on some bogus, dreamt-up definition of blackness. Shall we? Okay, I'm coming down now off my soapbox. I want to thank everybody for joining me on this journey. And if you watched in their entirety 2 overly long videos, I've got nothing but mad love for you. If, on the other hand, you pick and chose your spots and found the parts that were interesting to you, that's cool too. Whatever your mode of viewing, I only hope that you found something that was thought-provoking in the mix. I'm Jeff Rowan. Thanks for watching.